As Magic players, we're conditioned into a series of known truths, sometimes referred to as fundamentals. These are the things that we mentally shortcut in order to help us evaluate cards and parse battlefields. When picking up a newer game, however, and wanting to understand how to play it better, some things are going to translate from Magic and some things aren't. With Keyforge, it's easy to try and co-opt things from Magic. The game was designed in part by Richard Garfield, after all, and it uses cards. But that being said, there are notable differences in the mechanics of the game that differ from Magic, and that's going to force a bit of unlearning in order to go from a beginner in Keyforge to a serious player. In this video, I'll be lecturing on strategies, tips, and gameplay methods specifically for Magic the Gathering players to improve their skill at Keyforge. If you don't already know how to play Keyforge and would like to learn, you can watch my instructional video that teaches you the game in less than 15 minutes, which I will link at the top of this video's description. Let's begin with a key concept many Magic the Gathering players will need to accept and understand if they wish to excel at Keyforge. Life gain is the most important thing. In Magic, we're constantly taught that cards simply gaining life aren't good enough. People aren't loading their decks up with copies of Healing Salve without some sort of life gain payoff. But Lava Spike is one of the most notoriously famous cards in Modern. Why? Because in Magic, Lava Spike is a card that puts its caster closer to winning the game, while Healing Salve is an example of a resource being dedicated to simply not dying, while not moving any closer to winning the game. In Keyforge, the primary goal of the game is to forge 3 keys at the cost of 6 amber each. That means that in this game, the most important thing is how much amber, or life, you can gain in a game. Gaining 18 life. Try and frame the objective of the game as gaining 18 life rather than dealing 20 damage. This is going to place a premium on creatures that are better at surviving in order to reap, and actions that are going to make it hard for your opponent to interact with your side of the board or produce amber of their own. There is a special step in the middle of this gaining of 18 life that dictates the pace of the game, and that it takes 3 turns of spending 6 amber in order to produce a key. The game ends immediately on the 3rd turn, but this means that each turn that your opponent can forge a key, you will have one of your own turns that you can interact with the opponent's amber reserve and try to knock them off balance via putting them down to 5 amber, when they may have otherwise thought they were safe to make a key and move closer to victory. Magic doesn't have this staggering between increments of life, and adjusting to the early, mid, and late game being separated so overtly can be difficult for Magic players, particularly when there aren't alternate win conditions and amber is the only thing that matters. Card advantage just isn't as important in Keyforge as it is in Magic. In Magic, there are control decks that don't interact with the life total at all. They may have some card that is able to deal damage or mill a player out in order to have something that ends the game, but many control decks simply try to whittle down the opponent's resources while snowballing an insurmountable advantage of resources. But simply put, in Keyforge, because of how the hand reset works at the end of each turn, card advantage doesn't have the importance that it does in Magic. Imagine that both players completely refilled their hand every turn in Magic, like they do in Keyforge. Cards like Mind Twist wouldn't be nearly as powerful as they are today, because the opponent simply replaces the cards that they discard during their next turn. In Keyforge, this means that the only card advantage that really exists is board presence. That being said, the primary reason to play creatures is to generate amber. Some houses are better at attacking and have payoffs for doing so, like Brobnar and Shadow, but others are more focused on what happens when you reap with them, like Mars and Logos. If the opponent has cards that can provide an insurmountable advantage on their own, it's important to be able to answer those creatures. But the fact that sweepers exist in every house means that constantly fighting over the board isn't a winning strategy. Getting too addicted to combat is the Keyforge equivalent to Magic's pointless life gain. It feels good to exchange resources with the opponent, but overall it doesn't matter that much, because if you aren't generating amber, you aren't getting closer to winning the game. Let's talk about recognizing which decks reward power turns versus consistent turns. The importance of what is happening on the board is going to vary from deck to deck, and the easiest way to tell the difference is simply by looking over the cards in your deck. This informs how much setup is required in order to make some cards powerful. Library Access is an example of a card that requires a reasonable amount of setup in order for it to be a powerful card. It's rare that this is the kind of card that anybody wants to be playing to only draw 1 or 2 cards. Playing 4 or 5 Logos cards in a turn with Library Access, on the other hand, is going to create a problematic number of cards on the table for the opponent to deal with. In order to set up these kinds of turns, decks with Library Access are going to prioritize playing cards from other houses in order to increase the likelihood of having several Logos cards ready to go on the turn that they finally draw access. Restringuntus is a card that is going to be at its most powerful when the opponent's most removal-heavy house is the best way they can interact with the card, and it can sit on the battlefield while restricting the opponent's plays. This means either clearing their battlefield and being able to keep it clear with removal, or attacking with creatures, or waiting until their most removal-heavy house are the only creatures they have in play. That way they won't be able to immediately attack down Restringuntus, and the odds that they end up without any meaningful plays increase. Looter Goblin and the War Chest are the kinds of cards that demand having the ability to destroy creatures the turn that they are activated. This is going to translate to already having creatures in play that can attack, or cards from Brobnar that allow fresh creatures to attack immediately. These kind of cards are going to lend themselves better to power turns as a result of their ability to get immediate use out of creatures as soon as they hit the table. Artifacts in particular also require fewer cards out of the hand in order to set up those power turns, meaning it's easier to play normal turns when building toward a particularly powerful turn. These type of effects in particular are powerful because they make your cards have a more immediate impact as soon as they come into play, which can make or break the power level of a card. Prioritize immediacy. When evaluating the power level of a card, it's easy to get caught up in the scenarios that involve starting a turn with a card in play, but with the opponent's ability to react to anything that's developed on their turn via actions, artifacts, or attacking with creatures, there's a premium placed on cards that can do something as soon as they come into play. Now, this actually translates reasonably well with Magic, as we all know that Enter the Battlefield effects and haste are very powerful, but it's even more important in Keyforge than it is in Magic. This is the result of the fact that players can't do anything on the opponent's turn, and so if your card doesn't do something on your turn, your opponent has a chance to deal with it before it ever does anything at all. Artifacts have the benefit of being difficult to interact with and don't have the same use it or lose it drawback that some creatures experience, but creatures in particular aren't going to be good enough a fair chunk of the time unless they're being played in one of the following ways. If they immediately do something when they enter play or serve a purpose for being played. This could be having a play ability, comboing with another card a la Hunting Witch, or simply emptying your hand for the sake of drawing more cards at the end of your turn. You play several of them at once. This makes it harder for the opponent to effectively remove all of them before you have the chance to use some of them. You want the opponent to spend their next turn dealing with what you have on the battlefield instead of reaping or doing anything else. This can be relevant when you're ahead on amber and simply need to buy time until you can forge keys at the beginning of your next turn or two. Now, these aren't always decisions that you can make in-game, but can help inform which decks are going to be more powerful than other ones when you're newer to the game and still trying to figure out what you need to be paying attention to in order to succeed. Try and internalize all of these points as you're playing with Keyforge, and you'll experience level up moments without having to learn these lessons the hard way. This video was developed by my pro player consultant Emma Handy, who is also a huge Keyforge fanatic. Together, we hope very much this video has been of some help to you, whether as a Magic player or a Keyforge player, or, like Emma and myself, as both. And this program was made possible thanks to a sponsorship from Card Kingdom, as well as the Patreon support of viewers such as you. So thank you.